Praise be Jesus and Mary. And welcome to a special edition of Fatima Today, where we have a unique guest, Mr. William Jasper. He is president of the John Birch Society and a United Nations expert and analyst. He has a wealth of experience and historical knowledge, which he uses to explain for us how the globalists are planning a takeover of the world and establishing a one world government. He also tells us what we can do to prevent this. So this is one show you don't want to miss. And welcome to another edition of Fatima Today. I'm your host, David Rodriguez, and today I'm joined by a special guest, Mr. William Jasper. Thank you very much for joining us here on Fatima Today.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here.
It is good to have you. For those of you who may not know, William Jasper is the president of the John Birch Society. He's also a senior editor and an author, journalist, documentary producer, and also has a well-earned reputation as one of America's top investigative reporters, most renowned for his in-depth, years-long investigation into the Oklahoma City bombing and its aftermath. And he's also served as an accredited correspondent at the United Nations in New York and UN summits around the world. You can find a lot of his articles at The New American. So thank you. Did I get all that right, or is there anything that I missed there?
You were perfect. You did it.
Good deal. So I guess before we dive in, just to have our audience get to know you a little bit better, and I as well, anything you could share with us just about, who you are, where you were born, married, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so I'm a child of the 50s. I grew up, was born in 52. My parents were World War II veterans. My mother, an Army nurse. My dad, 82nd Airborne, paratrooper, Battle of the Bulge, and all of that. And they came back after the war, got married, and started to raise a family. They were devout Catholics. My father was a convert during World War II and started raising family. I grew up with 10 brothers and sisters, so big Catholic family.
Nice.
Served my first Mass in 1960, which would have been, of course, a traditional Latin Mass. There wasn't anything else at the time. And grew up in Idaho, working in the woods and in the sawmills and the paper mills and plywood mills and working on the railroad, that kind of thing. Then went away to college and promptly lost my faith, and it was back during the time of the British rock invasion and everything else. And so I went the way of the world for a couple of years and declared that I was a Marxist. And
wow.
But that didn't last for very long because Marxism is supposedly scientific materialism. It's not scientific, but it is materialism. And I knew there had to be something more. I had temporarily rejected my Catholic Christian faith, but I knew there was something more. And so I looked around, went to a number of different crazy New Age, Eastern mysticism-oriented things. And then that didn't satisfy me either. So I came back to Christ and Christianity, but it was in the evangelical churches, and I bounced around there, and none of those satisfied me. And I particularly knew my parents; they were praying for me all the time, and that's what I credit with my return to the Catholic Church. But the arguments that for the sacramental faith and for the faith of the patriarchs, which when you go back, so-called Bible Christians will always say, well, they go back to the Bible, but where did we get the Bible? And you go back to the earliest records we have of the church from the apostolic era onward, and you find that the oldest extant literature from that time period, from whether it's from Polycarp or Eusebius or Augustine or whomever, they recognized the existence of the church hierarchy, the church structure, and the church liturgical experience and the sacraments. And so intellectually, I was brought back to the church. And I also had a spiritual, emotional connection to it because my parents, I recognized through their lived experience, their example, that there was something very solid there that I saw play out in other faithful Catholic lives as well. So it was about 2 years that I was away from the church, but I came back. But then when I came back in the church, there was all the confusion as to, well, which church? Because it was clear that many of the churches, particularly the one on campus at the university, was pretty spacey, left wing, and it didn't sound a whole lot different from the psychology and sociology classes I was taking. So my parents had become very alarmed at what was happening in the church and what was happening politically at that time as well, socially, what they could see the degeneration of all morality that was going on, sex, drugs, rock and roll that was ravaging the whole culture. But also the Vietnam War was on, and the communists were taking over most of the world. And so they were looking for answers. Sorry about that. And so they were looking for answers, and they were heartbroken and exasperated by the destruction within the church that was taking on. So they began looking for old retired priests who would come to our home and say Mass there. And so I was reintroduced to the traditional Latin Mass then in the late 1970s. And so I've been going to the traditional Mass ever since.
Sure. Reminds me a little bit of a very good friend of mine who was born in 1950. He's actually a medical doctor and the godfather to one of my daughters. But he, like you, also left, although probably a lot longer. I'd have to check with him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was gone from the church for some 20 years maybe.
Mm-hmm.
He definitely missed a big gap. But he says that when he came back, he no longer recognized things. And one of the things he quips, I don't have no way of verifying this, but he tells me, he says, what happens if you took one of those old Volkswagen Beetles, which was actually my first car, a little Volkswagen Beetle, 68. But anyway, he says, if you take one of those and you take it apart into all these tiny, tiny, tiny pieces, and over a long enough time, feed it to a human being in small enough, tiny pieces, then over a significant amount of years, you could swallow the entire Volkswagen into your system. And I'm like, really? He goes, and that's how he explains. He goes, that's kind of how it happened. But, you can never swallow the Volkswagen whole. So that's what they were trying to do to me, right? I left. When I came back, he says, 20 years later, they wanted me to swallow the whole Volkswagen in one bite. I couldn't stomach it. So interesting analogy he gives me. But that's a fascinating.
Similarly, so after I graduated from the University of Idaho, I went, that was 1975. I went down to Planet California. Total different culture shock, a total different picture down there, and to Los Angeles. So from rural and small town Idaho, up in the forests and the mountains, down to the jungle. And one of the things that I did, I joined the staff of the John Birch Society at that time. One of the Vietnam War had just finished shortly before that in 1975. And there was the issue of the POW MIAs from the war. And there was a POW by the name of Larry Stark who had come back from Vietnam, had been a POW for 5 years. And so I was taking him around Southern California on a speaking tour. And so we were just, he was Catholic, and we stopped at San Gabriel Mission. And he got very emotional. He said the most difficult thing for him when he came back to the United States was to see the devastation in the church, because, he knew that he had already seen about all the demonstrations against the military and all of these things. So he kind of expected that, but he thought at least the Catholic Church will be the same church for the last 2,000 years.
That
And
anchor.
yeah, and so he said that was the hardest thing for me to see. He said I didn't even recognize the church anymore.
I've often wondered how many people we lost in that time. There's statistics out there, but my uncle had a similar experience. He was there in a small city in Texas and went out to, I think it was the Navy, might have been a different part of the branch of the armed forces in Florida. And he got there when all the changes were taking place. And I guess Florida was just ahead of the curve than where he was from. So he went to a Catholic church and walked out thinking, well, this isn't Catholic, even though the sign says Catholic, it isn't. And for a series of Sundays, he kept going to different churches there out there near the base in Florida where he was at. And he concluded that the Catholic Church just didn't exist over there. And it wasn't until, I don't know if it was 6 months or a year later. So he just stopped going to mass because he couldn't find his Catholic faith, Catholic Church, until he got back home, 6 months or a year later, and goes and sees the priest that, he served mass for. And then the priest explains, well, no, these are the changes happening, and we're starting to do them here also. And but that was his initial sort of reaction, how shocking it was to him. And I imagine how, what you're describing with this POW. So definitely. Just to step back though for a moment, because you have such a fascinating journey, through all of these stages, like you mentioned, the Marxism and the Eastern mysticism, and then even evangelicalism. In your reflection, is there anything you can sort of pinpoint to going back to the beginning? What got that ball rolling? What had you, let's say, dissatisfied with your Catholic faith? Anything in particular, or?
Well, that's a good question. When I reflect back on it, a number of the things that made the changes for me. Well, for one thing, I had gone to Catholic schools, and I in grade school, and had been well catechized. But then we moved to a small town where there wasn't a Catholic school, and it was a government school, public school, with all of the attendant evils that go along with it. And this was in a small town, so it wasn't really radically bad like many of the big city schools. However, it was purged of all spiritual content. There were lots of worldly bad influences in it. And I trace back gradually, just associating with the wrong elements in school, and gradually becoming more worldly, alcohol and marijuana, and so you just gradually, and of course the big element, which was the music revolution or the noise revolution at that time. And I also, because I've always been a voracious reader, that is a good thing, to be scholarly and studious. However, the content of what one studies is, of course, very important in that. And because I was a voracious reader, and I was advanced beyond most of my classmates in that, I read a lot of things that my older friends and cousins who were in college gave me, and they were getting all the Marxist propaganda, so I was reading that, and it started having an influence on me.
Okay. And then in terms of coming back, I mean, you've already mentioned sort of maybe the role that the patristics and just some of the early fathers may have had in your intellectual conversion. Was there any moment, any real significant thing you think that let's just, I mean, for some people it happens, for some it doesn't. But for example, let's say you heard God calling you, like it's time to come back.
No, for me, there was never any burning bush or anything like that, like some people have. But there were a lot of wake up calls because I saw the disaster that the worldly life was having on so many people. In fact, from my high school days, the last 2 years of my high school and first 2 years of my college, I could count over a dozen friends who lost their lives, who were killed either because of drugs, because of alcohol, driving off the road, five in one car. So I could see where this was leading and the destructive nature it was having on so many lives that I thought, no, this is not the way I want to go.
Well,
So,
that's good. You learn from the mistakes that others make. That's certainly
yeah.
something I try to instill in my own children. A couple of things you've mentioned, though, that really jump out at me is obviously one, this Marxist connection, because Our Lady of Fatima speaks specifically against the errors of Russia covering the face of the earth. And then also, as you mentioned, this devastation in the church that you're seeing and that others have seen, that has an influence on you. Because again, Our Lady warns about that at Fatima in the Third Secret. She talks about how there'd be an apostasy that we begin at the top, warned against the suicide of all trained the doctrine, the liturgy, and the church. So as I hear your story, with my background, I'm connecting a lot of things with Our Lady of Fatima. How did you connect those? When did you come to know about Our Lady of Fatima? How did you learn about the Fatima message?
Well, I knew about it from Catholic school when I was a child, and Fatima was a big thing in the 1950s and 60s as I was growing up. And then it kind of just went away, both from the church's ecclesiastical as well as from public discourse. It pretty much disappeared. And I always had it kind of in the back of my mind. I believed in it. And when I came back to the faith, I started praying the rosary again. But I didn't really have a big grasp of it until Father Nicholas Gruner, founded the Fatima Center, came to Los Angeles when I was down there. So when I went to Los Angeles, I went for several years undercover into the Communist Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Party, Marxist, Leninist, the Socialist Workers' Party, which is Trotskyite group, and a number of campus-related groups connected to Hezbollah and the PLO.
Wow.
And so I knew what was going on down there in terms of those who were dedicated communists trying to overthrow our government and their fellow travelers who were maybe not as radical, but I could see how they used the front network to expand their influence. So I was doing that for the John Birch Society, and I was a journalist at that time for the Review of the News magazine and American Opinion, which were the predecessors to our current magazine, The New American. But also I was working in that capacity with the Western Goals Foundation. And that was a foundation set up by Congressman Larry McDonald and Congressman John Ashbrook and General Patton, the son of General Patton of World War II fame, General Singlaub, Admiral Thomas Moore, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they had recognized that our internal security apparatuses in the House and the Senate and in the executive branch had been stripped away during the 1960s and 70s. And so they were trying to get a private intelligence database going. And so I was working with them and bringing documentation and photos and stuff from these undercover operations to the database, which they were had set up in Washington, D.C. So while I was doing all of that, Father Gruner came to Los Angeles and looked me up because I had done some communication with him. And I toured him around Los Angeles, and he uh, said mass publicly in a number of places, including at MacArthur Park down in the middle of Los Angeles, which was all the gang activity and illegal aliens and whatnot, and distributed hundreds, if not thousands, of brown scapulars, invested people in them out there in the outdoor mass. Anyway, and I introduced him to people around Los Angeles, but in doing so, it reacquainted me with the Fatima message, and I had not realized all of the scholarship that had been done on it. And then I think it was subsequent to that, Frere Michel's 3-volume work came out, plus Father the Fatima Crusader was putting out lots of literature, and that's how I got reacquainted with the whole Fatima message.
Well, I'll have to touch base with you later just to see if we can get you at some point here to write an article for the Fatima Crusader one of these days. But no, much of what you say I think is interesting because, again, it parallels much. I owe my love to Our Lady of Fatima, knowledge of her to my mother. She grew up with that strong devotion. Again, she was born 1942, so she's growing up, like you say, in the 50s. And just as you said, she's told me many stories of how back in the 50s especially, it was just this big momentum. Everybody kind of, all Catholics knew about Our Lady of Fatima, and there was that great expectation that the third secret would be released in 1960. And so she had that devotion. And then, yes, it just kind of just fizzled away. So I grew up with it, but mostly just praying the rosary. And it wasn't until much later, again, through finding resources that Father Gruner's apostle at the Fatima Center put out, that I began to realize that Fatima was much deeper and involved so many more things. So there's, a lot of strains you've already touched on. Obviously, Our Lady of Fatima is predicting that these errors of Russia will cover the earth and cover every nation. I gather in much of what you're saying that, I should just ask, have you seen evidence of this? If you wanted to tell someone about that, what might you point to show them how these errors of Russia have infiltrated throughout the world? What means have they used? What agencies?
Well, that's a very important question. And one need only look around and see that the errors of Russia in terms of communism, Marxism, Leninism have spread all over the world. In the Communist Manifesto and in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' writings, in Lenin's writings, in Stalin's writings, Mao's writings, they essentially use communism and socialism interchangeably. Yes, there is kind of the formal phases of communism where capitalism will yield to socialism and then socialism will bring in communism. But in every one of the communist countries, including communist China today and communist Cuba or communist Vietnam, they refer to themselves as socialist countries, as socialist communist dictatorships. And so we have seen all over the world through the past century communism taking over one country after another. And then supposedly at the end of the last century in 1990, the Soviet Union, the first communist country, collapsed, or so that is the narrative. And that just left communist China and Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, etc., as communist countries. We don't have time to go into it here, but we have at the John Birch Society, the New American Magazine, and in my talks, one have pointed out that the so-called collapse of communism under Boris Yeltsin was a false collapse. It was a controlled collapse, a planned collapse, collapse being in quotations, because we had already had 3 decades before a defector from the Soviet Union, Anatoly Golitsyn, who explained in a very detailed series of reports, which were to the CIA. He was a KGB defector from the most secret inner part of the KGB that planned strategic deception. And he said that there would be a fake collapse and would remove the face of the enemy, and that this would be the most dangerous time of communism, because the West would exult and proclaim that they had won, and the communists would be able to greatly expand their spread throughout all the rest of the world. And so that is what we have seen. As I mentioned, communism and socialism are basically interchangeable terms. And so we have seen the spread of socialism all over the world, Marxist Leninist socialism. And there is the hard communism of communist China and those that are already the prison states. And there is the soft communism, socialism, which is the gradual kind, which we're seeing here in this country, where now in New York City with Mamdani, and in Minneapolis with Fateh, you have people who are proclaimed socialists. In Seattle and in Portland and most of our blue cities, you have either people who are proclaimed socialists, i.e. communists, or far left Democrats who won't quite admit to being socialists or communists yet. Yet they are pursuing the same policy, which was explained in detail in 1948 in a very important document put out by the Czechoslovakian Communist Party. Their chief theoretician, historian Jan Kozak, formulated and explained to the assembled communist leaders there how the communists had taken over Czechoslovakia, and it's called revolutionary parliamentarianism. And he explains there how they very gradually started nationalizing, the government taking over more and more areas of civic life, of government, of private business, of private property, until they then could drop all pretenses and they had control of the military, the police, and everything, just like we had here a couple of years ago as the Biden administration was moving forward on all of those fronts. So on that level, it's very clear that communism, socialism on the political economic sphere has been taken over. But it's also evident to Christians of all backgrounds, or even non-Christians who have any kind of natural moral base, that the whole world is awash now in a pornographic and hedonistic, totally degrading wash of media, and it's permeated all of our culture. That is part of the errors of Russia too. So people will point to Russia today. In fact, it was at one of the Fatima conferences in Niagara Falls. Father Gruner asked me to speak on this issue, and I got pushback from some of the really wonderful Catholics there who were upset with me because they said, how come you're attacking Vladimir Putin? He's the only moral leader in the world. He's against abortion. He's against the homosexual agenda and transgenderism. I said, well, if that were true, I would truly be singing his praises. But I do not believe that is true. Here's why. President Putin and his regime have, yes, they've put restrictions on abortion, which we don't have here now. But I said, so did Stalin. Joseph Stalin did the same thing. Why did he do it? Because he needed more cannon fodder. At that time, the communists needed women to start producing more children. So they clamped down on abortion and gave incentives for couples to produce children. With regard to the pernicious LGBTQ LMNOP agenda, yes, I would welcome our presidents and our officials doing the same thing. But what is the reason why he's doing it? The same thing that every communist dictator does. Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Xi Jinping, Ho Chi Minh, they don't allow that kind of perversion in their communist regimes because they know it causes a complete breakdown in authority and in social cohesiveness, which they need in order to keep their regimes going. So it's a total. So if you go to China today, you're not going to be able to. You don't see the big pride parades or anything like that. They want that to go on here, and it was the communists who promoted that here. The first real big gay rights proponent here in the United States, and who was honored by all the LGBT community, is Harry Hay. And Harry Hay was a member of the Communist Party, and he, in Los Angeles and then in Washington, D.C., started the Mattachine Society back in the late 1950s, which was a secret communist homosexual organization to go out and recruit other homosexuals. And back at that time, that kind of perversion was so not just frowned upon, but was considered so subversive that the Communist Party couldn't even tell its other Communist Party members that they were involved in that, because it would have shocked many of them, even though they were atheists and whatnot. Most communists back at that time couldn't countenance that. So they wanted to use that, and not only that, but drugs and all of the other debilitating, degrading vices that they could promote in order to break down our society.
Well, that does start making a lot of sense. I think you're putting a really good piece of the puzzle there together for us, because we, especially if we have a Christian or a Catholics are the Christians. If you have a Catholic background, you do think in terms of morality. You do think in terms of God. You do think in terms of your final end, heaven and hell. But of course, the communists reject all of that. And so this is not a moral position they're taking, but a purely utilitarian one. All right. And so then whatever means advance your goal, that's what you push. So if the means are push forward, unnatural vices in your country or another country, you go ahead and do it. And you can deceive all you want with that. It doesn't matter, because as long as you're achieving the communistic goals, and it's a utilitarian. But then if your country is not served by it anymore, as you point out, like Stalin, then now the utilitarian, uses are gone. But we look at that and interpret it in moral terms. And we're looking at it wrong because we don't have those communist lenses. It's purely utilitarian for them to continue to advance their goals. In fact, just correct me here or nuance it. What I hear you telling me is that even this fall of the Soviet Union that was planned, it's almost like on a chess move, on a chess game, where you're willing to sacrifice certain pieces because you're interested in the final victory. And so the communists, always being, I believe, an international movement, aren't so concerned with the territory of the USSR. They're not so concerned with Russia the way Our Lady is concerned about those souls. They want to advance their goals. And if it means sacrificing part of, the USSR, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, to advance these goals where they can then infiltrate the rest of the world more subversively, again, that's utilitarian. And they're willing to do that, and it's at the snap of a fingers. That's their move.
And you have hit on a very important key part of this, because since the fake collapse of the Soviet Union, they have expanded exponentially. How? Well, just think of it this way. Prior to 1989, 90, the Soviet Union had 3 votes at the United Nations. Most people say, what? Yeah, well, they had one for Soviet Union, Russia, for Soviet Russia. They had one for Belarus, and they had one for Ukraine. After the Soviet Union split up, now they had over a dozen votes just in the former Soviet Union, because each of those are now independent countries, and each of those get to put their embassies in countries all over the world, their consulates all over the world. And almost all of them, it's been a couple of years since we did a rundown on each of those countries and the permutation of the Communist Party of those into, now they're called a socialist or a workers' party or whatnot. But all the same individuals. And then people, they talk about, well, but they're not communists anymore. They privatized. Well, who did they privatize them to? Virtually in every country. And I've traveled over there in the former Soviet Warsaw Pact countries and whatnot, and spoken with people over there. And almost all the cases, of course, the Communist Party officials, they all of a sudden declare themselves to be capitalists, and they become the new oligarchs, and the state properties are given to them. But we still have, as in Russia, we still have the KGB, renamed now as the FSB. Vladimir Putin, of course, was their top guy in their FSB. Now he's their major domo. So we see in all of these countries, and not only in the former Soviet Union, but the Warsaw Pact captive nations countries. I went to the World Summit on the Victims of Communism in Vilnius, Lithuania in 2009. And people from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, Latin America, who had lived under communism came there. Many of them, their families had been murdered. Many they came from, had been prisoners in the Soviet Gulag. And they told their stories. Very important gathering. Where was the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS? Oh, they couldn't be bothered with that. They would rather go across the world to Timbuktu and report on three lesbians who had chained themselves to a UN summit. So. But not only were all of these countries, and most of them still remain, permeated with communists in their government and in all of their major institutions, but they have gone to all of the United Nations agencies, of which there are many. We just published this issue of the New American Magazine, which is the global power grab. That's a UN insignia on there, of course. And one of the things that we have in there is this map of the world. I'll send you the copy of it, which shows all the UN operations around the world and all of their headquarters for all of their buildings, massive buildings for their agencies in Geneva and Paris and Berlin, Bonn, Rome, Rio de Janeiro. The infrastructure for a global socialist, communist, new world order, the superstructure and infrastructure has already been built. We have this massive bureaucracy. And I was our correspondent at the UN for over 30 years. And so I've been at the UN headquarters in New York and many of their agency headquarters around the world and at their summits around the world. And what is very clear, and we've reported on it extensively in the New American, is that the communist involvement, particularly from communist China, has, and even Bloomberg, Associated Press, and Reuters, and some of the other agencies have finally reported on this. All of these agencies are now very heavily staffed by agents from communist China at high levels and at the intermediate levels and at the low levels. They've been inserting their people into there. And in addition to that, who's the Secretary General of the UN now? It's Antonio Guterres. He's the former president of the Socialist International. And the Socialist International was founded over a century ago, actually in 1886, by the Fabian Socialist Society of England. And it has a dominance of the UN now, and they actually have their World Socialist International conferences at the United Nations headquarters. And so they are pushing not just the Marxist Leninist program politically, economically, but also all of the social programs, the pro-abortion, pro-perversion, all the transgender mutilation, and all of the programs like the COVID vax and things of that nature, which are really pushing a medical dictatorship.
Wow. No, yeah, I want to go there in a minute, but before I get to that, because I see that sort of maybe is more the end where we're sort of headed to right now, I want to step back for a minute to something you said quite some time ago, but I wanted to ask you about it just to get the story straight or make sure I understand it. Um, when you were in LA, you talked about how already you were working with all these different individuals like General Patton in the 60s and the 70s because the internal security was being compromised, if I understood that correctly. I mean, could you just speak to that a little bit? Is it
Yeah,
my understanding then that these communist agents that, not only do they blow up a country and thereby get a lot more power with 12 smaller countries, but they were already seeping into all the different governments of all the different countries, certainly the United States.
absolutely. So if you go back to World War II, uh, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is president. And during the Roosevelt administration, we saw a surge of communists from the Communist Party, actually the American US Communist Party USA, but also some who were Soviet agents who were surreptitious communists who went into the Roosevelt administration. What did they do there? Well, they dominated economic policy, pushing for all the the socialist program, expanding government at home, but they also, very importantly, uh, pushed a foreign policy agenda which undermined one country after another and helped put communists and socialists in power. Most notably, because it's still biting us today, is China. And so the Roosevelt administration had a horde of communists in the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, etc. And when after World War II, 1945, war ends, within 4 years, they had undermined Chiang Kai-shek, our ally, who fought with us in World War II against the Japanese, and had replaced him with Mao Zedong and the communists. And all the while they're saying, oh, no, they're not really communists, or when they did admit they're communists, they're saying, oh, they're really, really good. They want to bring about democracy, etc. Well, after Mao Zedong took over in 1949, people started asking, who lost China? How did we lose China? How is it that the communists now with Russia and with China have and Russia was taking over Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all those countries? Why does this keep happening? Why does our State Department keep favoring these people? So we had investigations in the House and in the Senate, most famously in the Senate with Senator Joe McCarthy,
Right.
and who was a patriot. He was also Catholic, senator from Wisconsin. And he has been relentlessly vilified ever since, and all kinds of slander and smears and defamation brought against him because he was telling the truth and he was trying to get to the truth. And there were too many people high in office. And this comes to the point of where another divergent point here, and that is that people who were investigating this began to realize, well, how come people in our government who, as far as we can tell, are not communists, why are they constantly helping them? And this became very clear, particularly in the case of Alger Hiss, the State Department official who was a Soviet agent of the Soviet GRU, their military intelligence, high level, was in the Carnegie Endowment and Council on Foreign Relations, and he was in the Roosevelt administration, and he was appointed to be the first Secretary General of the United Nations at its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945. So he helped write the Charter of the United Nations, which is a communist document. People were supposed to revere it. This great document. It is not. I've written a couple books on this, and anyway, so people started looking into him. He was a very high-profile guy, and David Rockefeller, John J. McCloy, the Dulles brothers all came to his defense. These people were not communists as far as they were globalists. They believed in a new world order, a world government, and they were working with communists. They were aiding the communists, and that has been continuing on up into the present day with the World Economic Forum and the Bill Gateses and the Warren Buffetts and all these billionaires who aid the communists and work with them. And so when these House and Senate investigations started, then there was panic in the globalist communist camp, and they had to do everything possible to stop them. So they started attacking McCarthy. They also started attacking the House investigative committees too. And these big billionaires and their tax-exempt foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, MacArthur, Garland, etc., started pouring more and more money into the American Civil Liberties Union, which was founded by communists, the National Lawyers Guild, and other groups which were attacking through lawsuits and attacking these investigative agencies. And then, of course, all of the liberal left fake news media began doing the same thing. And so they ended up doing away with most of these investigative bodies that were supposed to be protecting us and alerting us to these dangers. And so that's why when Congressman McDonald and Ashbrook and Crane and General Patton, General Singlob and Admiral Moore and others decided, hey, we've got to do something until we can reestablish these committees.
No, well, that's great to hear, because I know you're telling us some important history here from the 50s and the 60s. But if I just feel like I switch out some names and some situations, you could be talking about right now. It's
Absolutely.
Like the same things are coming out of their playbook, and I hope people are noticing that. So if it's
the really diabolical nature of this, which I'm sure many of your audience can appreciate, is that the very people who have been helping the communists then turn around and say, it's Trump who's the Putin ally. It's Trump who's the Putin pawn, And
gaslighting is one of their big tools. Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, I know you're not a prophet, but you have a lot of knowledge and you've seen some patterns. So when you say that the superstructure and the infrastructure has already been laid out for this new world order, and we see all these forces that have obviously been working on this since World War II, and I believe certainly before, I mean, how do you see it sort of playing out? Like how do you think they're going to try to accomplish this? What could we sort of maybe really be worried or watching out for? I don't want to use the word worried, but what are the warning signs? What do we watch out for? What's coming?
Right. Well, very important question, because we have to discern the times that we're in. We have to try to see the dangers over the horizon before the hordes, the enemy hordes, come down on us. And there are ways of doing that. It's actually right. A lot of it playing out before our eyes. So it's very clear that the United Nations, which was set up in 1945, the internationalists at organizations such as the Aspen Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, refer to the United Nations as the second tri-world order. Sorry if my rooster is bothering you there. The first tri-world order was the League of Nations following World War I. That didn't quite and the same internationalist forces were promoting that. They didn't succeed in getting the United Nations or the United States to join that one, because too many Americans said, no, we don't want to get entangled in all of that. And so they referred to us, as those who opposed it, as isolationists, these terrible people that just wanted to not have anything to do with the rest of the world. So then they came back after World War II and got enough people to buy into it, saying, hey, we don't want to have another world war. We want world peace. So let's have this United Nations, and we'll all join hands, sing Kumbaya, and everybody will be peaceful. They thought that they would be able to turn that into an actual world government by now. It hasn't happened because there's been too much resistance to that. Because to have a world government means you have to place world power in the hands of a government, and that would not be a good idea, even if we had all Christian nations, until our Lord Jesus Christ comes back and is Christ the King to rule over us. So in order to do that, they have to scare us into accepting more and more power. And we saw just a couple of years ago, the World Health Organization, which was founded as an adjunct of the United Nations in 1948, 3 years after the founding of the UN, suddenly was able to do something that has never happened before in human history. They locked down the whole planet. All of humanity was locked down. Now, the World Health Organization didn't have to actually send out people to do it, because they had already gotten all of the nations of the world to buy into having this World Health Assembly of Experts tell us what was good for the health of the planet. And so all of your health authorities at your national, state, and local levels just fell into line. And that's what they have planned for doing this on a number of different levels. We see right now, the World Health Organization is trying to gin up another panic over, what do they call it, their chikungunya virus that's supposedly going around. I don't think they're going to be able to convince enough people to buckle under on that again, but they're trying to do that. They're trying to claim that the climate change, global warming, is a global existential threat that has to be taken so seriously that we have to give the Paris Accord authority over our lives, get rid of all fossil-based fuels, and go to so-called renewables. That would be a prescription, a number of scientists said, for global depopulation, because we know, as the experience has just shown here in the past few months in Portugal and Spain, who went that way, and all of a sudden their grid's gone down. So right now, the UN is being built into a global policeman on energy, on viruses, on pandemic, on given world taxing authority. Just a few months ago, the UN voted to begin taxing on all transportation, all sea transportation. So that means, the vast majority of the world's products that you and I depend on, and people all over the world depend on, are shipped from China, from Europe, from Latin America, from other countries, from Canada, via container ships. And once the UN gets the ability to tax all of that, they won't have to come to the US Congress anymore. The US taxpayers pay for all the UN's operations that are moving us into this diabolical new world order of transhumanism and abortion on demand and all of those things. But if they have the ability to tax then that means they don't have to ask us for permission anymore. President Trump has withdrawn funding from the World Health Organization, from UNESCO. We've been proposing for years to get out of the United Nations completely. It's a diabolical organization. And fortunately, this year is the first year that after 60 years of hammering on this, that we have viable legislation in both the Senate and the House to do this. The Defund Act, which is to defund, DEFUND, sponsored by Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Congressman Andy Biggs. And it calls for completely withdrawing from the United Nations, withdrawing all of our funding, withdrawing from all of its agencies, and that would, to put it mildly, put a kink in their whole operation. So, what's the possibility of that happening? Well, that depends on us, and it depends on God. The problem that I see with a lot of Catholics, the same as with other Christians, is that in looking at the world in an eschatological viewpoint, you say, well, this is the end times. There's nothing we can do to prevent this. Look at the way the world is going. It's just got to follow that course, and all we have to do is pray. And I say, yes, we have to pray. I've been working on this on the human level for 50 years now, and I certainly recognize that human effort alone, politics alone, education alone, pamphleteering, any of those, podcasting, that is not alone going to do it. But God always uses all of those things in his plans, whether it is to stave off this demonic New World Order for another 50 years or 100 years, or and to get us out of the United Nations. I believe we have to work and fight as if everything depended on us, but pray as if it all depends on God.
No, well said. I mean, I definitely remind people who think we're at the end times that Our Lady of Fatima promised that in the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph and there's going to be a period of peace. So we may be close to the end times, but I know we're not there because we have not had that period of peace, and that's still coming once Russia is consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Our Lady. And obviously she holds a solution. So I do urge all Catholics and non-Catholics too to live the message of Fatima, which is what our Crusader issue coming out will really focus on, how we live that message. Our time is rapidly coming to an end here, which is really unfortunate. I hope I can have you again because there's so many threads. I'm just going to throw out a couple of threads that I want you to think about, on our audience to think about, that I like to pursue, and then finish with one question. One of those is obviously just pursuing this idea of the role that the UN is playing. And also, we haven't gotten it all into, going back to World War I and World War II, and you've mentioned some of these different individuals. Well, I see very much then a connection between the French Revolution and the Communist Revolution, and how they're really kind of tied. And if you start studying the history, a lot of the same agents who began pushing for the French Revolution continued their revolutionary activity throughout the 1800s and are culminating in many ways with World War I, which is when Our Lady of Fatima comes. And of course, when we look at the French Revolution, we don't so much speak as of communists as agitating, though they had Marxist ideas, but we talk about Freemasons. And we talk about the Freemasons doing that. So then that brings us to that connection between Freemason and communism. So I hope we can address that in a future show. And then, of course, the infiltration of the church. When you're talking about the one world government and the way they're trying to control everything, well, we're spiritual beings, and so they have to have that angle as well. So those are things for a future show. What I can't let you go, though, without letting me know right now, because I'm really itching for this one, is your take on what is going on right now then between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, the UN is playing there, NATO's playing there, we got Putin. We've been mentioning these different characters, and a lot of it seems hard to make sense of this. So what's your best read on this conflict that has been devastating, that part of the world for so long now?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I think any any person with any human feeling has to be extremely sympathetic to the Ukrainian people. Uh, they have suffered so much for so long. Uh, I frequently, when I was in New York, I would go to the Ukrainian Congress uh, Foundation and meet with the Ukrainians there because back in the 1930s, when the Soviet Union was, are we still on there?
We are. You just got
I
dark.
lost my lights apparently.
Something's going on. What you're about to
Okay.
say is someone doesn't like it.
It's darkening. Uh, at at that time, Stalin, the Red Army went in and murdered by genocide, by starvation, millions of Ukrainians, and the West did nothing about it. In fact, Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who was the reigning doyen of the press corps in Russia, was a Satanist adept of Aleister Crowley, and was a drug addict and a tool of the Soviet Cheka, the KGB at that time. And he convinced everyone in the West that nothing was happening there, and he got a Pulitzer Prize for it. And so when I would go to New York, other times I had a friend who worked in the subterranean bowels of the New York Times, and he took me up there, and I took photos of their Pulitzer Prize there, and we tried to get the New York Times to have to give back its Pulitzer Prize for those lies and deception and genocide support there. So I'm very sympathetic to the Ukrainian people, but the war that's going on there now is a complex thing, and I don't believe one can really take sides with Russia, as some people are. But at the same time, it's been complicated by the fact that Ukraine uh, and the regime that is running it under Zelensky, has been put in there by the globalists, including George Soros. I mean, this just came out even more in the recent revelations by Tulsi Gabbard from the the intelligence community assessments. So we know that the globalists who are pushing this want to have a conflict there, and the worry that many of us have is that it could go nuclear, and it could become a nuclear war, World War III. I think that they plan instead to continue this battle going on between Russia and Ukraine for quite some time to drain us. Russia is constantly being replenished in their arms by China, uh, and it is actually weakening the United States. Our military is being destroyed, whittled down. All of our armaments are not being replenished. Uh, and when it gets to a point where it's advantageous to Russia and China combined, because they are working very closely hand in hand. I mean, that's been very clear it's been increasing for the last 10 years. They keep having Xi and Putin meeting and signing agreements. So uh, it's a very dangerous time for the United States to be getting involved in it there, as well as in Gaza. The the globalists, I believe, are playing us to, as they have been doing for a long time, to continue bringing us down economically, militarily, socially, to the point where we are no longer uh, an impediment to their vaunted New World Order. So,
Well, Our Lady of Fatima is the only solution for all of these things. So, Mr. Jasper, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, I do hope you'll come on again because, as I said, there's a lot of threads from this conversation that I would like to continue, and I hope our audience does as well. Invite our audience to send in their own questions in the comments if they'd like. Please do like this show, share it with others, subscribe to our channel, and we'll be here next week. Well, again, I think we'll have some special guests. But any parting words, Mr. Jasper?
Well, I just would like to second your uh, comments that this is a time for prayer and sacrifice. We have all been negligent in upholding the faith and of being the church militant here on earth that we're called to be. And so we have to redouble our efforts at prayer and sacrifice and work on all levels, both the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And that includes our civic responsibilities.
Yes, it does.
I just say thank you for carrying on the battle, for carrying on the mantle of Father Gruner. He was a very dear friend. I served Mass for him quite a number of times. And so we need to all increase our efforts. And I think
Well, we will continue. Yes, we will continue his legacy. We will continue to honor his memory, and we'll continue fighting until, of course, Russia is consecrated. We're in the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And then, as we like to say, our work is really going to get started, because then we're going to have all these converts to the faith that we're going to have to, catechize and teach the faith. And so much work to be done, all for the glory of God. Thank you so much again for joining us. And we'll be back. We'll be back next week. Don't forget, Our Lady of Fatima has the only solution. May God bless you. Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us.